Hello, my name is Rickard, and in this video, I'm going to do a review and show you how to use Optics by Boris FX. This video is sponsored by Boris FX, who create visual effects software for film and video. They're actually Academy Award winning in that field, and recently they've released Optics, which is a plugin for Photoshop and Lightroom. In this 2-hour video, I'm going to take you through the entire plugin, all the filters that are available in it. I'm going to give you my own review of the software and also show you some tips and tricks on how you can integrate Optics into your compositing workflow to retain all the editability of your layers and the layer stack in Photoshop. Now, if you want to follow along, you can download all the files that I use in the course of this tutorial in the link in the description of this video. Also, if you haven't already purchased Optics, you can get a 15% discount by using the promo code nuclei-borisfx. You can see that here. I'll also include a link to that in the description, and also a link to a free trial of the software if you want to check it out before buying it. All right, having said all that, the first thing we're going to do is take a look at the Optics workspace. So let's get started. All right, let's go to File, Open, which is Command or Control O, and then we're going to open the sample comp file here, and this is a file I put together to show you some of the features in Optics and also discuss some of the things where I would prefer to use Photoshop over Optics, and also some things that Optics can do that Photoshop can't do, in which case Optics is a huge plus as a Photoshop user or a compositor. So let's go ahead and go to the folder called Optics Sample Layers. I'm going to turn on the bottom one, which is the composite without the jellyfish on there. And we're going to use this as kind of a starting point. So to access Optics, you're going to go up to Filter and down here, Boris FX, and then Optics. So let's go ahead and select that, and you'll see the Optics interface open. Give you a quick rundown of the interface here. So in the very top, you have kind of your tool options bar. Right now we have the gear, which is basically your check mark. When you're finished adding effects, you're going to click on that and that'll put you back into Photoshop. Next we have the cancel button. So this basically cancels out any effects and puts you back in Photoshop without doing any of the changes. This resets all your effects. And then this adds a mask to your current layer or effect. Down here we have the effect stack, which is similar to the layer stack in Photoshop. You can add a layer like this by clicking on this little icon here. That will give you a new layer. You cannot delete the top layer, which is your current or active layer, but you can delete previous layers by clicking on this edit icon here and then hitting the delete button. So that's how you delete one of these effect layers. A few other things to note is that this button here is the edit button, so that essentially makes that effect active. So if you want to go back and make changes to a previous effect, click on this button here. This one shows you the effect, so it's kind of a way to do a before and after, similar to the eyeball in Photoshop. And this turns the effect on or off, so this will allow you to turn off the effect or turn it back on. And then this here enables or disables the mask. So if you have a mask on the layer, this will enable or disable it. This adjusts the opacity of the effect, and then this adjusts the blending mode of the effect. Although I will note that most of the effects have blending modes already built in. All right, here is obviously your viewport. It's where you're actually seeing your image, seeing the effects take place. Here you can zoom in, zoom out, you can fit to view. This allows you to zoom into a certain portion, and this is your hand tool. However, the space bar also does work. So the shortcut for using the hand tool and moving around is the spacebar, which is the same in Photoshop. However, one difference is that when you hit the spacebar, you're actually immediately engaged. You don't have to click to move. So a little bit different behavior from Photoshop, but once you use it a bit, you'll get used to it. So this allows you to adjust the resolution of the effects. So this is just the preview. It won't affect the resolution of the effect when you bring it back into Photoshop, but it does make it faster. So if you have a slow computer, you can put it on 1K instead of full. I believe full is 2K. So just realize all the effects are being done at 2K resolution. So just that's something to consider. These are various ways to see your image before and after. So basically to compare, you can do side by side, you can do a vertical split, you can do a horizontal split, or you can do a toggle. And when you hit the toggle button, you'll notice this, and that allows you to toggle on and off. This allows you to create a snapshot similar in Photoshop, and then this allows you to look at your mask. So if you have a mask added, you can turn the mask view mode on or off with this button. I'll show you that when we actually get into using an effect with a mask. And then finally, we have the histogram, which you can see down here. If I turn that off, this is how I'll turn it back on. You can also go to view here and go to window and turn the histogram on there. So that's the histogram, and that is this top panel. And then finally here you have the presets and the parameters. So this obviously depends on which of the filters you've selected here. So then we come to the filters themselves. Here you can see kind of a tabs showing you the different groups of filters. And here you have custom. I'll show you how to create those, and favorites, and I'll show you how to populate that. And then here you have multiple views. So for example, if I select one that has quite a bit like color, if I click on this, it's just going to switch the view to go downwards, whereas this has them all in a single film strip. So that's really just how you're going to view your filters. And that's kind of an orientation on the optics, workspace, and just familiarity on how it works. All right, the next section we're going to take a look at is all the filters available for color. And most of these tools are pretty similar to things that already exist in Photoshop. The first one is auto adjust. So this allows you to auto adjust your color, your contrast, and your levels. All very similar to features that are in Photoshop. Same with black and white. This is similar to the black and white filter in Photoshop, and also allows you to adjust which of the colors are affected. So here you can see I've got filters for my various colors, and I can adjust the brightness, contrast, and gamma of those individually. Next we have the channel switcher, and this allows you to switch, green and blue swap. It basically just switches the channels around. Again, something that you can do with the channel mixer in Photoshop. Next we have color, and this just adds a completely blank color. And really this has no value in and of itself. However, if you are building a filter stack, you may find it comes in handy. You could do an overlay with this. For example, I could put this on multiply and add a yellow cast to my image, and then adjust the opacity if I were doing this as some kind of a workflow. So in and of itself, not that valuable. If you're using optics as a workflow outside of Photoshop, it can be quite valuable. Next we have color correct, and this basically allows you to do color correction. So I would say it's similar to curves in Photoshop, although they do have curves. So this is, basically just gives you another viewer option, similar to the way levels and curves in Photoshop allow you to do the same things, but each one you may be more comfortable with that kind of a workflow. Like myself, I prefer doing curves when I do color adjustments. It's just I'm very familiar with the way the curve works and how the curve adjusts based on the histogram and all the colors. So it is my preferred workflow. And here we do have curves. It's pretty much identical to what is already built into Photoshop. Next we have Develop, and this gives you similar features to Camera Raw and Lightroom in terms of exposure, recovery, which is like haze, fill light, blacks, brightness, contrast, vibrance, saturation. So very similar to the basic feature set of Lightroom and Camera Raw. Okay, next we have Enhancing. And, you know, not entirely sure the value of this. It's essentially another way to adjust your image. Again, this is not one that I would use. Same with fluorescent. It basically adjusts the, sorry, I'm going to put the opacity on this back to 100 so we can see what it's doing to our image. And let's put it on normal. So here you can see this is basically adding a blue cast to your image or a fluorescent light cast to your image. Haze, similar to Photoshop or Camera Raw and Lightroom, this allows you to adjust the haze. We have a high contrast, hotspots. This allows you to adjust the white balance of your image. Hotspots just basically runs levels or curves to isolate the hotspots. Kelvin allows you to adjust your white balance. Levels as levels. Low contrast, you know, does just that. It allows you to adjust the contrast of the image. Match is similar to match color in Photoshop. It does exactly the same thing. You can select another source. So in this case, I can select another image, and then you can adjust how much of the brightness is affected by your source image and how much the color is. Again, this is something that's already built into Photoshop, so I wouldn't use it here. But if you aren't using Photoshop, it's a great tool to match your image to a color grade that you like in another image. Here we have ozone, and what I generally do when I'm using optics is I look at what the presets are, and then from there, if there's an effect that I like, I can select it, then go to parameters and adjust it. The polarizer, you can see here, is basically putting a warm filter on the image. We have selective color, selective saturation, shadows and highlights, and sky, which seems to add contrast to the image. Threshold, which also exists in Photoshop, and then tone adjust, which basically lightens all these shadows. So virtually all the color tools, if I were using a Photoshop workflow, I would stick with Photoshop because there's no real tool in here that isn't already available within Photoshop. And because optics works on a single layer, I have more control within Photoshop where I can do it as an adjustment layer. And so all my bottom layer stack is still editable with an adjustment layer. Whereas if I do it with optics, I'm having to do it on a flat layer. Now I could get around that by doing it on a smart object version of all my layers, but it just adds another step to the workflow that's not necessary. So those are all the color tools in optics, and next we'll look at diffusion and blur tools. Next we have diffusion and blurs. This allows you to create diffusion or blur effects on your images. So let's take a look at those next. For the diffusion and blur tools in Optics, I'm going to select this portrait layer here and then open up Optics again. Okay, so let's look. The first one is beauty, and this one is designed for portraits, and essentially what it's doing is it's looking for those skin tones and making adjustments to them. It's both adjusting the color and also, as you can see in some of these, it's doing subsurface blurring. So if you want just to look at, you know, some possible looks for your portraits, this could be good. But personally, I would use the tools within Photoshop to do the same thing. Really what you're getting is smart blurring and some color adjustment. All right, next we have blur, and this is basically just a Gaussian blur, but within Optics rather than Photoshop. Again, super valuable to have, because realize that in Lightroom, there is no blur tool. So if Optics is your workflow and you're not using Photoshop, these are great tools. Same with the color tools. But because I use Photoshop in my workflow and I'm using Optics as a plugin for Photoshop, where there's something that I can do inherently within Photoshop, I'm going to always default to using the Photoshop tools. Okay, next we have blur channels. So this allows you to blur the various channels independent of each other. Now you could also do this in Photoshop by just selecting a channel and then doing a Gaussian blur on the channel. But you know, you can do it interactively here. They also have some presets that look kind of cool. You can also adjust the X and Y. So basically you can make the blur not, you know, basically stretch one way. So that's kind of cool as well. This is not something I would use a lot, but if you have a particular use case for it, great. Okay, next we have blur chroma. So this basically blurs your color without adjusting your luminosity. Again, something you could do in Photoshop by switching your image to lab, or by taking a copy of your image, taking your image, making a copy of the layer, putting that layer on color blending mode and blurring it will get you the same effect. So again, this is something that I would do in Photoshop rather than doing it here, but you know, it's got some cool presets if you want to check those out, and they may inspire some ideas. Directional blur. Same as the motion blur in Photoshop. I will say that this, the interactive control is far better than Photoshop. The downside is that it doesn't use transparency, whereas in Photoshop, you're blurring not only the image, but also the transparency of that image. And Optics doesn't currently respect the transparency of a layer. It will keep the transparency of a layer, but it does not affect it. So if you're using a blur tool, let's go ahead and just take a look at that so you can see what I'm talking about. If I select a layer here, for example, this, well, let's take this lady, right? So she has transparency. If I go in and go to Filter, Boris FX, Optics, and I select the motion blur, or sorry, the directional blur here, and I blur her, and then I hit OK, you're going to see that it's blurred, but it hasn't changed the transparency in Photoshop. So it's not a very workable solution unless you're using it on an already flat image. Okay, so back to our portrait here. Let's go back to Boris Optics. Okay, next one we have the blur motion, and this is actually a really great tool. They have something similar in Photoshop in the blur gallery, but it definitely does not have these kind of controls. So this allows you basically to control where it's blurring out to, where it's blurring out kind of like the front blur and the back blur, and then this is the point that's blurring. So I could see this being quite valuable if you are making some light rays behind a tree, or want to create some motion effects on your image. This is a really cool tool, the blur motion. All right, next we have center spot. This is similar to the iris blur in the filter gallery. Again, I would use the feature in Photoshop, but if you're using optics with Lightroom that doesn't have any blurring tools, this is a great way to create that kind of low-mo, strong blur vignette that you'll see in some old linotype photographs or old camera photographs. Next, we have depth of field, and this allows you to blur similar to the tilt shift blur in Photoshop, where you can have a gradation that goes from one point to another, and you have 4-point control here. So very similar to the blur gallery in Photoshop, but you know, you do have 4-point control, which you don't have in Photoshop. But really, there's nothing in here that I can do with optics that I can't do in Photoshop, so I would stick with Photoshop on that one. All right, next you have diffusion, and this is basically a layer put on top using the overlay blending mode. So that's what these are. Again, I would probably use Photoshop for this if I were doing it myself, but obviously you don't have this option inside Lightroom. So if you want to add this kind of effect, maybe to give your image a old look or something like that, this could be quite valuable. You can also give it some kind of color in here. So there's definitely ways that you could use this. There's a lot of different diffusion layers that you can use for different effects. So that's something that you could play around with. Personally, I would rather just have these as images that I can pull in as a layer in Photoshop. But again, if you don't have Photoshop or you're using Lightroom, then this is a great feature set to have. All right, next we have double fog. This is basically just a white overlay layer. Next, you have edge aware blur. This is very similar to the smart blur in Photoshop, where it detects where you have edges and then blurs the rest. So for skin cleanup or turning something more into painting, this effect might come in handy. Next, we have fog, and what this does is it blurs all your highlights. Something that I could do in Photoshop pretty fast, so I'd probably just do it in there. All right, next we have this free lens. This kind of creates this glass panel in front of your image, and as you move this around, you'll notice that it's almost like manipulating the back plate of your camera. I could see this having some use, but so far I haven't really figured out anything that I would do with it, but it's there. That's kind of cool. All right, next is frost, and this is kind of a skin cleanup. At least that's from what I can tell. It's basically just cleaning up skin. I would do this in Photoshop. Halo is similar to fog, but a little stronger. Mist, again, these are all pretty similar to each other. What they're doing is they're making a copy of the layer, blurring it, and then blending it on top of the original image. So these four are all doing a similar thing. All right, next we have rack defocus. And for blurring something, like if you want a whole background blurred, I really like this. And the reason I like it so much is it does a really good job of kind of duplicating the effect that a proper lens blur does. So in this case here, I've blurred it, but what I can do is I can go into my parameters and change this to, let's say, 6 sides, and you can increase the bokeh, And as you're adjusting these, this little button here will reset it. So that's just a good thing to know. If you click on that, it resets it, and then you'll notice that the button is no longer available. So if you want to see what you've changed, you can always look for the ones that are highlighted, and then if you click that, it'll bring it back to its default state. Yeah, this is a great example. So this and with the shape changed to 6 sides, that really looks like a realistic bokeh. Maybe change this to even 8 sides. But this really looks more like something that is out of focus in camera rather than blurred in Photoshop. So I really do like this rack defocus filter, and that's one that I would definitely use. Silk, similar to net, and then split field is just basically a line of blurring, very similar to field blur in Photoshop, except for it's a line, so I guess it's more like the tilt shift, except for it's just 2 sides. You can split top bottom, and you can also adjust the split blur. So if I do this, you can see now it's has a larger space between the two. And those are all the diffusion and blur tools in optics. The next section is Film Lab. Let's take a look at those next. For this next one, I'm going to go to the full portrait layer and then go here to optics. I'm going to go ahead and reset and then go to Film Lab. So the first one is bleach bypass. And here you can see various presets, and essentially this is going to give you that effect of high contrast with less color, is generally what your bleach bypass is going to be. Is it's going to give you that high contrast in your luminosity and low contrast and low saturation in your colors. Next, you have cross processing. And primarily the way I would use these is looking at these as inspiration for color grades. Because oftentimes you have an image, it looks good, and you'll see that a color grade makes it look a lot better, but how do you know which direction to even start with a color grade? So for that, a lot of these filters are really good because they have really well designed presets that you can begin with. So if you're kind of hunting around for a look for your image, or you want to see what your composite will look like with a strong color grade on it, I really suggest looking at these Film Lab ones. So that's bleach bypass, cross processing. Next we have film damage, and this basically allows you to make your image look like damaged film. I would say this is probably a lot more valuable for you know, like video because look what happens when I scroll the seed. It actually looks like, you know, an old film, but on a single frame you do get some cool artifacts. But I would probably just use some vintage overlays or some damaged film overlays in Photoshop rather than having to flatten my image to do this. But as I've mentioned before, if you're using Lightroom or not using Photoshop, you have all these effects that you would otherwise would never have. Next we have film effects, and this is great because you actually have a lot of nicely built presets in here that you can take a look at. You know, like disposable glam, don't point at me, gives it kind of a paparazzi look. So just a lot of different looks that you can check out here. All right, next is film stocks, and this honestly is one of my favorite set of presets inside optics. Just so many great looks, and they're all based on real film. So if you're a film fanatic, this is great. But also if you just want to look at what your image could look like in other color grades, this is a great way to kind of explore those various looks. And the way I would use these is I would select one that I really liked, and then, so let's look at this. So this is Fuji Lomography, and I'm going to hit the gear button, which is going to apply that, right? So this is a great color grade, looks really cool. And now that I know that I like this, well, what I can do is I can go in here and just basically do the same thing, but with a curve layer. So if I go back in my history here and turn on this curve layer, you'll see that I basically replicated that using a curve layer. But I would not have ever come up with this curve if I hadn't first seen that inspiration. So this, for me, as someone who really tries to keep everything in Photoshop, a great way to use this is to find those color grades that you really like and then duplicate them with a curve, because the beauty of this is I can now save this curve in here. Where is it? Custom. Here. And I can call this Lomo, Fuji Lomo. And now I have this, and I can use it for any of my composites or any of my portraits. I have this as kind of a built-in curve, and I can always go in here and adjust it and even take the opacity down and so forth within Photoshop. So for me, that's the ideal way to use the Film Lab tab in Optics, is find those looks that you really like and then just duplicate them in Photoshop. So that's film stocks. Flashing is very similar, but basically what flashing does is it colors either the highlights or the midtones or the shadows. So similar to two-toning, but it also adjusts luminosity. All right, next we have grain, and that's just the grain. You can add grain, monochromatic, or color. You can also do that in Photoshop. Next we have looks, and if you look at the parameters here, you basically have the full tool set of Camera Raw in here. So it's a way to build different looks, and you have all these looks that are already pre-built. Again, if I'm using Photoshop, I'm going to build these looks within Photoshop, but if you're not using Photoshop, this does provide some tools that Lightroom doesn't. Next, we have Vintage Color 2-Strip, and this kind of works similar to the channel mixer in some ways, except for obviously they're pre-designed to already have certain film looks in mind. So like if you've got a film where the yellow color has kind of depleted out of the film, this is kind of what your image would look like. This is a blue crush, so again, blue is pushed up, yellow is pushed out, so forth. This is a nice one, Hugo Teal and Orange. Turn that on and off here. You can see it's a subtle change, but it's quite nice. And then you've got a similar thing, but with control of 3. And if you look at the parameters, you can see you can control the tint and various other parameters here. So that's the Film Lab. The next section is gradients and tints. We're going to take a look at that section now. And let's open this back up. I'm going to reset it, and I'm going to go to gradients and tints. And this basically allows you to put a color gradient on top of your image. So here you can see blue, and this controls where your gradient starts and where it ends. So if I just want to do it like this, I could do that. And then here you can see the color of your gradient. So that's a single gradient there. Next is a color spot. So basically anything outside of the spot is that. This allows you to do color vignettes. And then a colorized gradient. So this is basically like a gradient map in Photoshop, where your shadows, midtones, and highlights can each be assigned a different color. Then you have a dual gradient. So that's just a gradient with two colors. All these I would prefer to do in Photoshop because I can do them as a layer and keep my layer stack and keep everything underneath the color gradient I can keep editable. So for all these I would use Photoshop, but there is no feature like this in Lightroom. So if you're not using Photoshop, then this is a great feature set for adding colors on top of your image. Next we have duotone. So this is the same as the colorized gradients, but you're only using two colors. Next we have gels, and this basically just puts a little bit of color on top of your image. If you want to, you could also use this as kind of a guide to see like, okay, what color looks best on this model or on this photo. But you could also just do that in Photoshop. ND gradient basically just adds darkness. So, you know, it could be like basically a black to transparent or a black gradient that you can control the opacity of. All right, next we have photographic, and this is similar to the gels but a bit stronger. Next we have quad tones, and if we look at the parameters of there, you can see this is basically like the colorized gradient, except for it's doing it with a threshold. So it's pushing all the colors toward these four, almost like a polarization. Next we have radial tint. So this is a tint that radiates out, and as we can see here, it's going from this kind of yellow-green color toward an orange, and then a pink, and then back to orange. So that's what that is. Next we have sepia, which basically adds a warmness to the image. And then skin tones. So these are adjustments that are all based on skin. And then you have kind of your standard split toning, where you can assign colors to your shadows, midtones, and highlights. So in this case, let's add some blue to the shadows, and then maybe kind of a warmer color to the midtones. And for the highlights, I'll just do kind of a brighter version of that. So that's what that does. Next we have sunset, and this basically adds a color gradient. So a lot of these filters use the same parameter sets, but they're arranged in a way that if you have one specific purpose, you can go to the preset for that. So that's that. And let's go back to grads and tints. And that pretty much finishes all the gradients and tints. And to be honest, if I'm using a Photoshop workflow, I wouldn't use these because I can accomplish all the same things in Photoshop using adjustment layers or curve or image adjustments, and I can do that inside my layer sets without having to flatten my image. So I don't see much of use of these if you're using a Photoshop workflow. If you're using a Lightroom workflow, or if you're just using optics as a standalone software, then this is a great feature set for split toning or adding color on top of your image. Next, we have a lens. Let's take a look at those filters next. And here we have chromatic aberration, so that will clean up chromatic aberration. Defringing, that will defringe. You can also use this to get rid of certain colors, which is kind of cool. But otherwise, I don't really see the value of that. Okay, lens distortion. Obviously, this is built into Camera Raw and also built into Lightroom. But if you're not using those, this is a great way to adjust your image if it has lens distortion. Next, we have radial exposure, and that is similar to lens distortion if your camera may be shooting wide, or if your lens has kind of a built-in vignette. This allows you to clean it up. All right, next is vignetting. So this is if you want to add a vignette to an image. You could do this in Photoshop with either a curves layer and a mask or a black layer. So, you know, personally, I would do it in Photoshop. But if you have a workflow, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, because a lot of these tools that I'm saying, hey, I would do it in Photoshop, that's all fine and good. But there is a way also within Optics to build your own kind of filter workflow. And in that case, it may be very valuable for you to have these tools in Optics, because if you're building a workflow within Optics, you don't want to have to go back and forth to Photoshop. So if I created a set of filters that turned a photo from a photo into an oil painting, I may want to have a vignette in there. So having that as an available tool is great. All right, next we have the warp fisheye. Again, this is something that's available in Photoshop, but Photoshop does not have this kind of previewing. So this is something where I might just use Optics instead of Photoshop, because with both Optics and Photoshop, I have to have a flat image to do it on. Same with this, the warp magnify. There really isn't something like this in Photoshop. So if I do find a place where this is something that I would use, then having this available to me is great. And the polarizer, this basically very similar to the polarization filter in Photoshop, but the beauty of this is that I actually can see the results in the preview window here. I cannot in Photoshop. In Photoshop, I have to run the filter to see whether I like the result or not. Next, we have light, and this includes my favorite filter in all of Optics, which is lens flares. So let's take a look at the whole section now. All right, for this next section, I'm going to open the image called light sample, and let's go to Optics. And let's reset this, go to lights. And the first one is ambient light. And basically this just increases the exposure of your image, and you can gel it as well. This is something that I would just do in Photoshop. All right, I'm going to skip over Aurora because I'm going to show you that in the a little bit later with a different image. All right, next we have dot. This just adds a dot to your image, which you can blur. Not really valuable in and of itself, but as part of a workflow, it could be very valuable. Next we have edge rays, and this basically creates a radial blur out or a zoom blur of all your highlights. So let's see here, and you can also control which channel and which color, which is really nice. So great for creating some either motion effects or some volumetric light effects. All right, next we have eye light. This is, as I'm moving it here, you can kind of see, it's basically for portraits if you want to lighten up the eye area. Next is flag, just the same as dot, but with a rectangle. All right, next we have glint, and glint is a really nice one. It allows you to create this kind of glinting effect on lights, and I can go here, kind of take the brightness down a bit and maybe take the threshold up just a bit. And as you can see here, we've got this light right between her, and it's creating this really distracting one here. So I'm going to use this opportunity to show you how to add a mask. So I've got this layer active. You can see this little icon is blue. So to add a mask, I'm going to click on here, and you can see I have various options. So I could just paint it out. I could also do a selection, and by selection here it means either a selection of your channel or of your luminosity. I can do an easy mask, which is similar to a quick mask in Photoshop, snap mask, path mask. So snap mask is, I guess it would be kind of similar to the magnetic lasso tool. I could do a path, so that's similar to the pen tool, or a spot or a gradient. In this case, I'm just going to paint it. So there you can see it is now blacked out everything, meaning nothing is showing. And I can invert that like this, and that will mean the entire effect should show. It's not for some reason, but let's see what happens when we start painting. So I'm going to make my brush kind of large and just paint in this area here where I don't want that effect. And as you can see, now that I've painted something on it, the mask is acting appropriately. White shows, black hides. Now the paint behavior on this is admittedly a little bit strange. I believe that they're going to fix this in a future version. Right now, as you paint, it's showing you a preview of painting in white, even though I'm painting in black. But that's how you add a painted mask. And then if I want to turn off the mask, I click on this little icon here. If I want to look at the mask, I can click on this. So that is kind of the, the very, very basics of creating a mask. I will show you a little bit later how to create an easy mask, which is one of my favorite mask tools in optics. So there's the glint. Glint rainbow is very similar, but it adds a rainbow effect to the lights. Next we have glow, and that basically takes everything that's white, or depending on where you set your threshold, everything that is on the right side of that threshold is going to be made bright like this. You can also color it, so nice for effects like lightsabers and stuff. Glow darks, as you can see, it's doing the same effect but to the darks. So what it's doing is it's taking the darks, blurring them, and then multiplying them on top of your image. And then we have glow edges. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this mask for now. And glow rings. These are all kind of interesting effects, but I don't see myself using them very much. Next we have ice halos, and I thought this was kind of interesting. It allows you to create these kind of interesting looking effects. I'm going to actually just add a layer so that you can see this a bit better, and under color I'm going to add just a black layer, and then I'm going to move this layer by clicking and dragging it, and then go back onto this and turn that on. Okay, so there you can see just what these look like. Actually, the iPhone 12 new screensaver seems to be using an effect similar to this. So kind of a cool light effect. Like if you had a cup sitting on a table and light splashing through it, that's kind of what you would get. Not sure how often I would use that, but I do think it's kind of a cool effect. Okay, next we have key light. I'm going to go ahead and reset this and then go to key light. Now key light basically takes all your lights and almost turns them into a 3D map that is now being shaded. Now it's kind of hard to tell here, but let's see. So this point, I'm going to go here. So as you can see, it's kind of making the lights almost 3D, so that as I adjust this, it's giving a shadow to them. Now you can use that to create kind of sharpening. It's almost like doing an offset in Photoshop, or a high pass, sorry, and then putting that on overlay. So, you know, not sure what I would use that for, but there it is. All right, then this is one of my favorite things in the entire program, and that's lens flares. I will mention here on lens flares that I used to use No Light Factory, which is a plugin that's currently available for After Effects as well as some other video software, but they stopped supporting it for Photoshop with, I believe, Photoshop CS 5.5. So that's a long time to not have any proper lens flare program for Photoshop. So to me, really optics is my replacement for the No Light Factory in terms of a really robust lens flare plugin for Photoshop. Out of all the plugins in optics, I know that this is the one that I'm going to use the most. All right, having said that, let's continue. Okay, so back to the lens flares. Basically, you have all these options for various lens flares, and you can add them in. You can control where they go. You can also control where they're lining up to. So I can put this here, but I can independently adjust the angle of it. Now I sell myself a lens flare pack, and it's cool because the lens flares are already nicely built. You can just dump them in, but honestly, having this gives you way more control, and you can adjust any of these to fit your needs exactly, which is really, really nice. And honestly, the price of the software, if it was only this, if it just had this, would be worth it. That of all the tools inside this program, this and a couple others in the render are the ones that I'm going to use 95% of the time. Most of these other ones, they're great, and if you're using optics as your primary photo editor, they're essential. But me as a Photoshop user, if there's anything that I can do in Photoshop instead of optics, I'm going to do it in Photoshop. And this, all these lens flares, I cannot do in Photoshop. The lens flares in Photoshop are terrible. They've been the same for about 20 years. And yeah, that's what makes, I mean, I could go on forever about this. Lens flares are crucial for compositing, whether you like it or not. They just are. They give you these great little effects that just sell the illusion of these images having been taken in camera, especially when you're doing a composite. And the way these work is you can set them however you want. There's parameters for each one, but the beauty of this is if you click on edit lens here, you actually get a whole different software almost that allows you to design your own lens flare. So really, really powerful stuff. I honestly can't say enough about how great this flare designer and the lens flare module is. It's definitely my favorite tool in optics. Okay, next I want to switch the image that we're going to use. Oh, one thing I will say on optics, okay, or sorry, on lens flares. The way I would use this with Photoshop is once I have the flare exactly how I want it, I'm going to go into parameters, and instead of combine, I'm going to switch this to flare only. Then I'm going to hit OK. Now, obviously I should have made a copy of my layer, so let's go back, make a copy, and then we'll just run optics again. Boom. And then put this on screen. So it's now exactly how it was, but I have the ability to move my flare around. So just in terms of workflow, generally what I'm going to do is I'm going to create stuff in optics, pull it in here as its own layer. That way I still have my layer stack and I don't have to flatten my image. And I can just use my blending modes. Whatever blending mode they're using in optics, I can use the same blending mode in Photoshop and then still have the ability to manipulate my layers. So that's just a note on flares. Now, for the next section, I'm going to go to the portrait here. And let's go back to optics. And the next one I want to show you is light. So what this does is it creates a light that sits on top of your image. And you have all these different ones here to choose from. And the nice thing about this, so let's go to the parameters. So I can adjust it quite a bit. And if I go, where is it? Gobo. Transform, scale. All right, so I'm going to scale this up. And notice what happens as it goes across her face and across her nose. It's actually warping to her face. So this, and if I go here, displacement right here. So this is how much it's distorting to your image. And let's pick one that's more just a line. So just an interesting way to kind of add a light effect on top. Again, just because I'm not a huge fan of having flattened layers in Photoshop, what I would do is if I really liked one of these and wanted to use it, what I could do is go into my parameters again and just go on Gobo here and then execute this, and then in here I can put this. Oh god, I keep doing it on the layer, sorry. I'm going to make a copy of that layer. And then what I can do is put this on the blending mode that works the best. So probably overlay, and take the opacity way down. And then maybe add some blurring to that layer. And if I don't want it to affect the darks, what I can do is go under here, and for this layer just bring this to the middle like this, and now it'll just affect the lights. So that's how I would do it. I really don't like having flattened layers in Photoshop if I can avoid it, but if you kind of get a handle on how to export from optics into Photoshop, most of the effects, and certainly all the generated effects, what you can do is you can pull in the object or the thing that you've created as a layer into Photoshop and then use it that way. Okay, back to Boris. So that was light. Next we have light leaks. And this basically is light leaks. They're all procedural, meaning they're not image based. So you have a lot of control on how you want them to look, but because they're not image based, they do have a certain kind of fake quality to them. Personally, I would stick to using photographed light leaks just because they have that sense of realism to them. But if you like these, you can certainly use them. And also if you have a workflow where you need a whole ton of light leaks, this is probably a great solution for you. All right, next we have overexposure. I'm not sure why you'd want to use that, but it's there if you need it. And next we have rainbow, rays. I'm going to cover rainbow and the aurora with another image, so we'll just skip over those for now. Rays is basically just taking the highlights and turning them into rays. I could see the value of this in creating volumetric lights. Then we have reflector, and this basically changes the highlight color. So, you know, if you're a photographer, you're probably familiar with a gold reflector, and this tries to emulate that. It's really just adjusting the luminosity and color, so this is not something that I would do in there. I would just do that in Photoshop. Same with this. It's basically a little spot of color, and you can try to use that to you know, maybe adjust the shadow area to be brighter. Something I would just do with a mask and a curve layer in Photoshop. Soft light, it's basically blurring your image and then blending that on top. Again, something I really wouldn't do. Spotlight is kind of cool. There is this feature in Photoshop, but you know, if you like this interface, which is, I would say, a little more intuitive, and also certainly faster previews than the one in Photoshop, could definitely use that here, get some cool effects, maybe something like this. Yeah, so that's what the spotlight does. Not sure what star does. And then light streaks is similar to that blurring tool, except for it's doing it with your highlights rather than the whole image. So good for creating kind of motion effects. It basically just allows you to blur your whole image. All right, for the last couple, I'm going to open the sky sample image. And let's go to, we'll just make a flat version of this. And we can call this layer sky. Let's make a copy of it. And I'm going to go to Boris FX, Optics. And let's go to Aurora. So Aurora lets you create an aurora effect, which is quite cool. Definitely not something built into Photoshop. And then with this, you can control where it's most lit, and then under your parameters, you can adjust. So, you know, may want this to be all that kind of green color. Create a pretty cool effect. So that's what the aurora does. And then the other one I wanted to show you here was rainbow. It basically just creates a rainbow. As you can see here, it's being cut off there. If I do go into here, I can adjust the radius, and I can adjust the crop and also the angle of the crop. So in this case, I might want to do something like this, and then maybe take the radius down a little bit. And there you go. Maybe move my crop just a little bit further down like there. So that's how I can add a rainbow. And then let's go to our light image. Do we still have it open? No. So let's open the light sample. And we'll cover these last ones here. So sparkles, basically add sparkles all over your image. Unlike the other one, this one here, which is doing it based on the lights in your scene. So this is only taking the lights in my scene. This one basically just adds random lights everywhere. And you can control them. So, you know, if you want to use this as a background, that would be cool. It also has a color option. I don't see the biggest use of that, but you know, you might like it. Okay, then finally this one is similar to the glint, except for it's doing it to just the whites. So you can see here, and you can control the amount of spokes and the size. So you might find some use for that if you're creating kind of a star look or a star field. Next, we're going to take a look at the render tab and the filters available in there. This is my second favorite of all the filters inside of Optics. So let's take a look at those and some of the really cool things that you can do with them. All right, for the next set of filters, I'm going to open Sky Sample and let's go to Filter Optics. All right, the first one is caustics. So this allows you to create this kind of pattern that you see at the bottom of a pool, but you could also use that to create some nice plasma effects. And the way I would use this is I would create it. I might just you know, do some adjustments here, but then I would just put it on caustics only, save that out, and then put that in screen in my Photoshop file and use that to create kind of a plasma effect. Next, we have clouds, and this is essentially just Perlin noise that you have more control over than the Photoshop Render Clouds filter. You can control the color, the offset, and also the frequency. So for creating any kind of you know, procedural pattern where you don't want anything repeating, this is a good tool to do that. Next, we have the cloud colors here, which appears to be a similar thing, but with some more scale color control there. Next, we have multicolor. Again, similar basic, you know, the basic structure behind this is a Perlin noise generator. And you have some color controls. You can create various procedural patterns with that. Next, we have Clouds Perspective, which is very similar to the last one, except for we have some actual perspective control. So as you can see here, this seems to be closer to us here and then fades away farther away from us, and you can control that here. I could put this on. Let's put it on screen for now. And in the case of something like this, I would obviously want to mask out the mountains. And I'm going to show you now how to use a few of these other mask effects, just because this is kind of a good opportunity to do that. So I mentioned earlier that if you click on this, you have various options for masks, and I showed you previously the paint. So I want to show you a few of the others. The first is gradient, and this simply creates a gradient from here to the top. And for an image like this, or kind of a sky image where I have a clear horizon, this may work perfectly fine. Let's just adjust this to something a little nicer. So maybe something like that. And if I click on this icon here, I can see my mask. So that is the gradient. The next is spot. Now you'll notice that if I click on spot, it's actually adding another mask to this filter layer. So this program does support multiple masks, and you can control how the two masks work together here. So this is adding the two masks together. This is subtracting this mask from that mask, and this is intersecting the two masks. So it gives you quite a lot of control in terms of how you can use that mask. And
Here you can control the feather from here to this point here. And that's kind of how those work. Now I'm going to go ahead and delete those masks, which I can just do with a little X there. And I want to show you the next one, which is path. And path is similar to Photoshop. I can create a path here with anchor points, and it's going to create curves between them. Now obviously I don't have as much control as I do in Photoshop with a path, but I can do a lot of what I need and also just add some feathering to the mask. For something like this, that would work perfectly fine. And this shows you the anchor points, so if you want to adjust those after the fact, you can. All right, so that's that one. Next, we have the snap, and I'll quickly show you how that works. So the first thing I'm going to do is just indicate with the left mouse button what's going to be my foreground, and then with my right mouse button, I'm going to indicate what is the background. And now you can see it's created the selection, and I want it to correct into there, and I want it to correct into there. And you can see that's now done a pretty good job of selecting that. And then I can click on, I believe, this button here. And now it's turned this into a path. And what I can do is now, if I want to, I could go in and adjust those individual points. And in this case, I would want to invert my selection. So there you have it. That's how you create a snap mask. And then next, I want to show you the easy mask, which is kind of similar concept. The first thing I'm going to do is indicate what is my foreground. I'm going to indicate what is my background, and I can also use this one here, the one that's the edge tool, and I can kind of draw over the edges where I want it to do more AI work to try to figure out those edges. And then you push on this little gear button here, and it's going to process the mask, and we can take a look at it here. So it's done a pretty good job. I might want to add a little more green right here, a little more red there. We'll do the same thing here and here and there, and then just push this again to regenerate. Maybe a little more red there, and maybe even a little more. And there you go. That's done a really good job. I'll invert it. And let's turn off our mask view. And there you can see we now have that in our background there. So that is how you use the Easy Mask. A really cool tool, and it does a really good job of figuring out what you want selected and what you don't want selected. In a future more advanced tutorial, I'll actually show you how to take this mask and put it into Photoshop. So if you want to use Easy Mask in here to create masks in Photoshop, I'll show you how to do that. All right, next we have selection. Let's go ahead and delete this one. And selection basically allows you to use luminance, hue, saturation, or one of your channels to create a mask. So you can see the little white dots there. If I go on here, so let's say luminance, and I can adjust this. So I might do something like that, or I might do a hue, and I'm going to select this hue here. You know, maybe something like this. Maybe just something like that. And in this case, you can see it's now adding it to here. This is, you know, it's, you'd have to play with it to get it to work right. Personally, if I'm gonna do a mask, it's usually going to be using one of the other tools. However, you may have an effect that you just want applied to the shadow areas or the highlight areas. And in that case, this really comes in handy because it allows you to select portions of your image based on color or luminosity. All right, and then finally paint, which I've already shown you. All right, next we have grunge, and this allows you to put a grunge on top of your image, and you can actually use this to create portrait backdrops and kind of a whole manner of just creating kind of a background surface for your image. Really the way I would use this is I would create the look that I want. So let's go ahead and add a mask to this. I'll just do an easy mask. Good. All right, so in this case, I'll just adjust this how I want, and it's got a lot of parameters here, so you'll have to play around with those. You know, this is a stamp density. This is the second stamp, which seems to be that kind of splotty color. I might change this to be a little more neutral. And same here. And basically I can go through all these, and then at the end what I could do is switch this to be just the grunge, get rid of the mask, go ahead and apply that, and then in my original I could go in here, select subject, and cut this out, and then use this behind there as my grunge in Photoshop. That'll give me the layers that I want, but I'll still be able to use the effect, and I can use the nice previewing inside optics to see exactly what that background will look like. So that's what the grunge is for. Next we have, I'll just go ahead and reset this. Okay, next we have laser beam, and I don't see many uses for this, but this basically creates a laser beam that you can adjust the intensity of, the brightness of, the color of. So I guess if you're doing something that needs that, you could use it. Okay, and then for Luna, I want to show you with a different image. All right, Luna basically adds a moon. So very simple, but very useful because the amount of controls in here are really great. I can control the size of the moon, I can control the color, the lunar phase. So in here you can see the lunar phase. And if I adjust that, you'll see it's adjusting the lunar phase. I can also adjust the amount of contrast. So in this case, the contrast is very high. I could lower that. I can also change the gamma here. So if I increase the gamma, I can also, let's see here. So this is the Earth glow. I could change that to something a little closer to my image color there. And that's probably a little, there you go. So something like that, and I might just change this to my brightest color in here, maybe this color here, and brighten that up even more. So now we're starting to get this looking really good in this scene. I can adjust my rotation. And this is another one where personally I would much prefer to have full control of it in Photoshop. So what I would do is I would build it out on my image exactly how I want here, and then just switch it to moon only, and then hit OK. And what I'll do is in here I can then just use an elliptical marquee tool, cut it out of the background to where I want it. So something like this. pretty straightforward. And then mask. And now I have it as a layer in Photoshop that I can do whatever I want with. So really valuable. It gives you a very nice kind of high resolution moon there that you have full control over. So for any image that you need a moon of any kind, this is an awesome, awesome filter. All right, so next we have muzzle flash, and muzzle flash allows you to add a muzzle flash to a gun. Now, personally, this, it's procedurally built. I believe it was built for animation, obviously, for video, where you're only going to see this for about 2 frames. So for a still image, they don't look the most realistic, but there are some cool effects, and you can manipulate them in 3D space, which is kind of nice. So you can really just get it lined up to your image. So yeah, for that, you could use it. I personally haven't found a use for it yet, but I also don't do that many graphics or images with guns in them. So if you do, super valuable tool. All right, next we have Night Sky. And this is one I really, really like because you very often have to create a star field. And the beauty of this is it's creating a star field. Not only that, but you have full control over it. And all these stars are actually in the right place for the night sky. So I can adjust the latitude and longitude, and it'll adjust the sky based on where I am in space. So it's very cool, and you can adjust the star size, the star brightness. So if I want really bright stars, all these things I have control over, which is really cool. And I can also vary size of the stars. So if I want smaller stars, the star saturation, if I want more of a white sky or white stars, I can adjust the glare, and you'll see here I have an edit glare, which is pulling up the flare designer. And if I want, I can adjust this as well, which is very cool here. So basically you have the entire lens flare editor in here that allow you to adjust the glare that these brighter stars are giving. So you have a lot of control in here. And even after that, you can in here adjust the glare brightness and the ray length here. So a lot of control to really create any kind of sky that you want. And again, if I'm going to use this in a Photoshop workflow, the way I'm going to do it is at the end, once I have it looking exactly how I want it, I'm going to switch this to stars only, hit OK, have a layer that I can then put on screen and place anywhere I want in my layered file. So again, this is one, and pretty much this holds true for most of the render effects from optics, is they give you this nice option inside the effect in the parameters of just getting the effect itself. So that's how I would use that. I would just get the effect itself, make a copy of my layer in Photoshop, apply that, and then have it as a layer in Photoshop that I can use. All right, next is Z-Zap, and this is an amazing way to create realistic lightning bolts with a lot of control. So in this case, I want a lightning bolt that's hitting the mountainside right here. And what we'll do is maybe add a few bolts like that. And I'm going to vary the endpoints a little bit. The bolt width. So a whole lot of controls here that I can use. So any kind of lightning bolts, this is how I would use it. And then just you can go to zap only, pull that into Photoshop and put it on screen. So a really great method of creating very realistic lightning bolts. And this is something I would see myself using all the time. A great example might be a composite like, let's go back to this one, like this image here. If I go to optics, you know, an idea I had was maybe I could do a lightning bolt that goes from this hand to this hand, and this just would make that super easy. I could go in here, kind of increase the number of bolts, and make this like that. Maybe give this a kind of green color like that. So right away, pretty cool effect, and I have a lot of control of what I can do with this. And then what I could do is add another layer here and go to my light, go to my lens flares here, and then look for a preset that looks kind of like a green laserish color. Maybe something like that. I'm worried that that might be just a little too bright. Let's try something like this. We'll put that there and then just scale it a lot. And maybe change the other colors here to a more green color. Like that. Maybe even the hotspot color a little bit more green. So something like that. I could adjust this. Maybe something like this looks kind of cool, like that. And then I can make another copy of this. And for this copy, we'll do the same thing. And I'm just showing you this because this kind of shows you how you can use various of these things together to create the effect that you want. You can use multiple effects stacked on top of each other. So I really like that. So now here's a scenario where I want all these layers in Photoshop, but I want them so that I can use them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add one more layer, and I'm going to go to color. And this is, I mentioned before, it's valuable to have these when you're creating a workflow. So in this case, I'm going to put this right at the bottom, right above the original. That way, when I come up to here, I have my effects, and if I process this, I have my effects here, and I can put this on screen. So that's just another example. Again, I have the ability to pull this in and use it as a layer in Photoshop, which is always going to be my preferred workflow. All right, next, let's go back a bit. And let's go back to optics. Okay, so the next one is zap from. Let me just reset this. So zap from basically looks for the lightest areas of your image and then zaps from those. So for an image like this, it's not going to work very well. So let's go to what might be a good image for this. What we'll do is a black layer, and I'll do a white, and let's do optics. And for something like this, what I would probably do is just prepare my file ahead of time. So like if I wanted a ball or some other object, that had lightning coming from it like this, I would just set it this way ahead of time. And then from there, I could pull it back into Photoshop once I've designed exactly how I want this to look. So pretty cool. You can create some nice effects, like if you had a bald with, you know, some kind of futuristic glow ball or something like that. You could design it all in here, pull it back into Photoshop, put it on screen, etc. Okay, next one is Zap to, and basically this, you select a point and it'll zap to the light part of your image. So, and in this case, you could also have multiple elements. So for example, let's put this back to black, and I want, let's say I have a man, actually we have a woman here. So I'm going to take her and I'm going to make her like this, and then this, we'll go back to optics here. Let's reset this, and under render we got zap to. So I'm going to do something like this, a little down there. Something like that looks pretty cool. And I'm going to set this to zap only. And then I can put this on screen. And we'll just turn these layers off. And I could do something like that. So again, of most of these render effects, the way I would use them in my workflow is render them out of optics and put them back into Photoshop, where I can use them as their own layer, adjust them to however I want them, etc. All right, that finishes the render section.
All right, the last section is Stylize. Let's take a look at those now.
And for this, we have basically a bunch of options similar to the filter gallery in Photoshop that manipulate, stylize, or kind of give a painted look to your image. So the first one is auto paint. You've got quite a few options in here. They don't look very realistic as painting, but some of these you could use kind of as a base plate in Photoshop. So for something like this, I might do this, and then in Photoshop, actually let's make a copy first. What I could do is just take the opacity on this down like this, and then maybe mask out the high detail areas like the eyes. And, you know, with a few other steps, this gives me a really nice painted look with that as kind of an overlay and just showing the background a little bit. So really cool way to get a very nice painted looking effect in Photoshop without a lot of steps. Okay, next, actually on this, I do want to show you, because there's quite some cool parameters in here. You can actually go for like a Van Gogh painting. Okay, so there you can see it gives you this nice Van Gogh look. So very cool effect that you can use. And again, for almost all these, what I would do is I would use them in conjunction with Photoshop. I already showed you that in terms of pulling it into Photoshop and then using that effect as a layer. All right, next we have borders, and this gives you the ability to put kind of any border you want onto your image. Obviously, this is something you would do at the kind of the last stage of your process. However, what you could do also is if you do like a border, like let's say I really like this border, but I don't want to have to do it on my flattened image, I could do this little trick again. Just add a new layer, go to color, go to black, put this underneath my border like so, and then hit OK, and then in here I can then put that on screen. Now I have my layered file, but I still have this nice border that I can play with, adjust, do whatever I want with. All right, next, let's go back. I'm going to reset this. All right, next we have the brush, and this gives you a painted effect. In this case, we have brush chalk, brush oil. You can increase the max size, the size range. Basically, this is kind of like an effect that you can use to create a painted look to your image. And I would use this maybe as a base plate. So if you do a very small size, you could use that as the basis and then do other effects on top to make it look more painted. And this might be a case where I could build up a layer stack. So for example, what I might do is do one of these. Let's do the S brush here, and do in the parameter. There you go. So as you can see, I can stack up these various effects and get a more realistic painted effect. And one thing I haven't mentioned yet is when you have a stack, and let's say you create a whole stack of filter layers to create one effect like a painting. So for example, I could do this, and then I could go back into, you know, maybe my film lab and pick a film stock that looks kind of painterly. Maybe something like maybe I do a faded yellow and put that on multiply. Not too much like that. Then I add another effect, and for this one I'm gonna do something like key light. That's gonna kind of give me this more you know, 3D effect. We'll take the strength down on that. Something like this. And then I could add one more for, let's say, some grunge. And I could even give this kind of an art attack. And then I could take the opacity in that way down. And maybe adjust my colors here to be more the colors inside my image already. So something like this. Okay, so let's say I have my entire stack. I like the way it looks. I don't yet, but in this hypothetical scenario, I'm happy with this outcome. What I can do is go up to here and do save setup. And then I can call this painting. And we'll just put this inside here. I'll hit save. And then in the future with any other image, so let's go ahead and use this one. What I can do here is go up to here and go recent setups, and painting is one of these. I'm going to select that, and it's going to apply that to this image. I'll have to go in here and adjust this mask. And there you can see I've now basically applied exactly that same effect, but to this image. Okay, so that is the brush, and that's also how you can save an optics workflow that you can then reuse. I'm hoping that in the future they'll actually have these as presets within the software, so I don't have to save them somewhere else. But yeah, for now it's not very hard. You can save it, and it does have this recent setup. So, you know, unless you're making a whole bunch, you'll probably be able to access it within the recent setups. All right, for the next one, we're gonna use this portrait layer. And The next one is cartoon, and this kind of creates an edge outline and then blurs the color underneath. And you could do this in Photoshop. Here they've kind of combined posterization with find edges, and if you like one of these, you can use them. Personally, I would just use the tools in Photoshop because that doesn't really present anything new. Next one is a combination of auto paint and cartoon. I do like this one. It creates a pretty cool effect, which I could layer up in Photoshop. So in this case, I would do something like this, add it in Photoshop. Actually, I'd have to do it on its own layer. And you'll notice that if I go to optics here as opposed to here, it just applies the last effect. So if you accidentally do it on your main layer, you can always just revert that, make a copy of your layer, and just apply it that way. In this, I would just, in Photoshop, probably do something like this, maybe add a mask for the high detail area. Something like this gives me a nice, really fast, cool painted look. All right, let's go to the next one here. Next one is color infrared. This is basically switching up some of your channels. So similar to a channel mixer, you can adjust contrast, hue, and then the blue and the magenta. All right, next we have color shadow, and this obviously creates a threshold of your image and then screens it on top of a gradient. Personally, I would just do that in Photoshop. I don't need a filter to do that for me. All right, next we have crosshatch, and this creates a crosshatch type image. You do have that in the filter gallery of Photoshop, although I will say here you have much more control than you do in Photoshop to create the exact look that you want. Okay, for this next one, I'm going to open day for night, and let's go to optics, and we'll select day for night. And as you can see, what this is doing is it is darkening your image and then switching the color balance to a much more blue color balance. So if you want a quick solution to going from day to night, you can use this. Personally, I would use Photoshop, but if you're not familiar with how to achieve the effect in Photoshop, this is a nice starting point. All right, next we have digital damage. I really like this filter. It's something that you cannot do in Photoshop. So any of the filters that really you can't replicate in Photoshop are going to be the ones that I'm more gravitate toward, just because if there is a way to do it in Photoshop, I'd rather do it in Photoshop. And for this, there really is not a way to do this in Photoshop easily. So I really like this. You have a lot of controls in terms of what you want to do with it. So that's one that you should definitely explore, take a look at. All right, next we have dog vision. Dog vision kind of creates a, basically just a manner of different looks that you can do by switching up channels as well as blurring channels. All right, next we have etching. Similar to crosshatch, it has kind of a pattern of waves that you can manipulate and which are distorted by the background image. I don't see much use for this, but there are situations where you may want to turn a photo into fake money or something, and that could be valuable there. All right, these next three, circles, hex, and rectangle, basically create this kind of lenticular effect where each block has a segment of that image repeated inside of it. If you want to, create the effect of something being behind some frosted glass or something like that, these can really come in handy. You can create some cool looks. You'd also create some nice effects, like graphic effects like this. So that's what those three do. The next one is halftone. And this basically just creates a halftone of your image in black and white. This is built into Photoshop as well as a filter. However, you do have better previewing options here, and you also have much more control in this area than you do in the Photoshop equivalent plugin. All right, same with the color halftone. You can create some pretty cool looks with this. If I'm using this with a portrait, so such as, let's actually do it with this one here. You can create some really cool effects. You know, that looks really cool, and so that's what that does. Next, you have halftone rings, similar to the etching, except for it's using it with these rings. I don't see the value of this, but if you do, great. All right, next we have the Harris shutter, and the Harris shutter basically allows you to map onto your other channels another image. So if I click here and select a different image like this, you can see that it's applying this into my other channel. It's a graphic design effect. Obviously, if you're doing something with this kind of double exposure effect, it's very valuable. You can also do it in Photoshop just using blending modes and so forth. But it is a cool trick that you can do. All right, next we have infinite zoom, and this kind of creates that Microsoft window within a window effect, and you have a lot of controls here. So it's kind of a cool effect. I don't know that I would ever use this particularly. It looks to me more like something that was designed for motion graphics, but if you find a use for it, awesome. All right, next we have infrared. This basically is like a black and white filter, but it prioritizes different colors in your image. I would do this in Photoshop personally, but there are some nice effects in there. All right, next we have kaleidoscope. This is something that is not built into Photoshop. Cool effect. You can create some nice graphics with it. I don't know in what scenario I would personally use it. I might do like a poster with this kind of effect, like right away. This already looks pretty cool. But it's, you know, obviously a very specific use case, and same with this one. It allows you to also create a kaleidoscope effect, but in this case it's doing it as a polar, and this one is doing it as a radial. So all these three do a similar thing, but with slightly different effects. You can also do this. So quite some cool effects that you can do inside there. All right, next we have night vision, and this gives you a night vision effect. I would just do this in Photoshop, but if you're not familiar with Photoshop, or you want a quick solution to just turn something into night vision, that's how to do it. Next we have parallel strips, and this basically cuts up your image into parallel strips. I actually have had use cases for this where I wanted to create kind of a digital distortion, and I had to do it individually by cutting out sections in Photoshop. So this is helpful for those kind of things. Next we have pastel. This is another just kind of a style filter. It gives you kind of a cool look if this is what you're going for. It's almost like a median blur in Photoshop. All right, next we have pencil, and this is similar to the pencil effect in Photoshop. However, I will say that the preview is much more intuitive than the one in Photoshop. I can also adjust the color saturation in the background to give a bleach bypass look. All right, next we have pseudo color, and this is kind of basically applying a rainbow to your image as a gradient map. And if you're looking for kind of a psychedelic effect, that's kind of cool. All right, next we have Roman tile, and you'll notice that there's a block up here that actually isn't going to show in your finished image. What this is doing is it's showing you what your grout looks like, what the elements between these looks like. And for creating kind of a tiled image effect, this is kind of cool. You could also use it as a backing for a painted effect. Okay, next we have texture, and this basically just puts a texture on top of your image, and you do have pin control of that texture. Again, this is something I would just do in Photoshop as a layer. You know, this is very similar to the pattern overlay in Photoshop, but if you have one of these that you really like, great. Also, this could be very valuable if you are using a series of steps. So in this case, let's go to Open Setup, and let's see if we can find the one that we did called Painting. So there you go. I've now added this paint effect. I'm going to add a new layer at the very top. Go to Stylize and then go to my texture. And I want to add a canvas texture on top of this. So I'll find one that looks somewhat like a canvas here. Maybe this one. Or actually this one here. And that's going to just help in my paint stack here to create a more realistic painting. So that's where I would probably see this as the most useful. All right, next we have TV damage. Again, this is similar to the digital damage, but it's more VHS kind of damage. I have had many situations where I wanted to create this effect on a TV screen and I didn't have a tool to do it easily. So this is a great filter that you just don't have available in Photoshop in any other way. All right, next we have a warp chroma. This is similar to that blur effect, but it's doing it with the colors. A very cool effect. I don't know where I would use it, but even just with one click like this and a portrait in the background, you've got a really cool looking effect. And next we have X-ray, which creates an X-ray effect. It's essentially inverting your image and then applying a blue to white gradient map to it. And that finishes the Stylize tab and also finishes all of the filters that are available in Optics. The last thing I'll note here is that Custom tab. And again, basically when you're in the parameters, after you've made changes to parameters that you like, you can name it here. So Rickard's X-ray, and then click here, and that will add it to your custom tab. So if you find yourself using or adjusting a certain parameter often, you can just add it and that'll create your own preset. And then favorites is on any of these presets. If you have that preset selected, you can click on the star here and that will add it to your favorites. So that's what those last two tabs are, custom and favorites. And that pretty much covers the entirety of the Optics plugin, pretty much from start to finish. I would say the one other thing that is more advanced is creating a stacked filter effect that you can apply over multiple images.
All right, there you have it. That finishes the entire run through of the Optics plugin by Boris FX. As you can see, there's a lot of filters in there and a lot of them are really cool and give you tools in Photoshop that you simply can't get anywhere else. Because this is a review, I am going to give you a few of my thoughts, some things that I'd like to see improved in future versions, as well as which filters I feel are the most valuable. So first I'll start with the things I really like. First and foremost, lens flares, hands down, my favorite filter in Optics. And if someone asks me, is Optics worth buying? My answer is, if it only had the lens flares filter in it, it would be worth buying. Okay, next is film stocks. For color grading inspiration, film stocks is great. I personally am not a fan of presets. I prefer to do things in Photoshop, including color grades, but When you're hunting for inspiration, it's actually great to be able to see color grades right away on your image. And as I showed you in there, the way I would use it is find the preset I really like and then just back translate a color grade for that in Photoshop. All right, next is edge rays. A great way to do volumetric light effects in Photoshop. I don't know, probably 15 years ago, I used to use a Photoshop plugin called Trap Code Shine. Like No Light Factory, it's no longer supported in Photoshop, so really there hasn't been a great solution for this. I really like the edge rays and being able to create volumetric light with that. Finally, we've got Zap for creating lightning. I know that Photoshop has some lightning tools in it, but way more control with Zap and really realistic looking lightning. That's something I use a lot in composites, so that's one of my favorites. And finally, even though it's relatively limited in use, I really like the Luna filter, being able to just put a moon into any scene that you want, being able to control the color, the contrast, the phase of the moon. Such a great little tool that I find myself using more and more and more now that I have it. Okay. In terms of things I want to see improved in future versions and updates, number one is support for transparency. Right now, when you pull a transparent layer, it flattens it on a white background and then treats it as a flat layer. I really want to see support for transparency in future versions. Also, like if you blur something with transparency and then put it back into Photoshop, I want to see the transparency blurred, not just the layer itself. All right, next is importing and exporting masks into and out of optics. Easy Mask is a great tool, but unless I can import my mask back into Photoshop, it's not as attractive as it really could be, because if I can import my mask back into Photoshop, well, now I have a whole nother set of tools for creating quick selections. All right, next is that the preset setup. So I showed you how you can save a preset setup, meaning a set of filters all being used on a single image, into a file and then import it back if you want to reuse it. Personally, I think those preset setups should be contained in the program. We could add another tab next to custom and favorites called like setups. And then as you create a setup, you should be able to just save it in the program and access it without having to save out and import back in. Next is the software needs more shortcuts. I use shortcuts all the time for everything. And there's a lot of things like even being able to look at before or after. There's no shortcut for it. I have to click to do that. I don't like that. I want shortcuts for everything. All right. And then finally, there are some UI improvements. I already mentioned a few of those, like the way you paint masks just isn't intuitive. There's also some shortcuts that exist in Photoshop and then are different in Boris. So wherever there can be consistency between Optics by Boris FX and Photoshop, I want it to be more like Photoshop so that it feels like one experience working both in the program and in Optics. Okay, so that wraps up everything. One quick reminder, if you don't have Optics and you want to get a 15% discount on it, use the promo code nuclei-borisfx. And finally, if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel, leave a like, leave a comment. If you have a question on Optics, I'll try to answer it. Otherwise, here's some videos to check out. Other videos, and I will see you next time.